but the implication is that it's the best movie. And I don't think that.
For over 7 decades, Woody Allen has crafted some of the most iconic, controversial, and emotionally complex films in American cinema. From the neurotic brilliance of Annie Hall to the philosophical melancholy of Match Point, his fingerprints are all over the art of modern storytelling. But long before he became a director, before the accolades and scandals, Allen was just a kid in Brooklyn, obsessed with the flickering images on a movie screen. Now, at 89, after a career that spans more than 50 films, Allen has finally revealed the 6 movies he cherishes most. Not his own, but those that shaped him, haunted him, and made him fall in love with the cinema in the first place. These aren't just movies he admires, they're the films he credits with changing the course of his life. And the list may surprise you. As he nears the twilight of both his career and his life, Allen's taste in cinema gives us rare insight into his mind, not the tabloid persona, not the neurotic characters he plays, but the real artist behind the camera. What does a man who's made films for over half a century actually love about cinema? What kinds of stories move him? And what do his favorite films tell us about the legacy he'll leave behind? Today, we dive deep into the artistic soul of Woody Allen and reveal the 6 films he holds above all others. Woody Allen's love affair with cinema didn't begin in film school or during some glamorous Hollywood apprenticeship. It began in the darkened, musty neighborhood theaters of Brooklyn in the 1940s. He was a shy, awkward kid named Alan Stewart Konigsberg, and the silver screen was his escape hatch from the noise of home, the weight of school, and the grind of everyday life. While other boys played stickball in the streets, Woody was sitting in sticky theater seats, mesmerized by Humphrey Bogart's cool detachment, the moral ambiguity of film noir, and the heart-wrenching tragedies of post-war European cinema. Movies were more than just entertainment. They were an education, a guidebook on how to live, how to feel, and most of all, how to tell the truth. Even if the truth was uncomfortable or absurd, he devoured everything. Screwball comedies, Russian epics, neo-realism, slapstick. He was just as obsessed with the timing of Bob Hope's punchlines as he was with the existential dread of Ingmar Bergman. And unlike most American teens who idolized cowboys and war heroes, Woody Allen found his gods in foreign cinema. Filmmakers like Federico Fellini, Akira Kurosawa, and Michelangelo Antonioni. These weren't just directors to him, they were philosophers. Their work didn't just entertain. It mattered. It lingered. It taught. It asked questions. This deep respect for cinema as a form of intellectual and emotional exploration would become the bedrock of Allen's own filmmaking style. Witty, brooding, self-aware, and always searching. By the time he was a teenager, Allen was skipping school just to catch matinees. He'd sneak into art houses on Manhattan's Upper West Side, clutching a notebook, scribbling down lines that struck him. Lines not just from actors, but from life itself. He was fascinated by how film could compress decades of love or pain into a single look or camera movement. That obsession became a calling, not just to write, but to explore the human condition through moving images. He said once, "For me, films are not a part of life. They are life. Everything else is just a distraction." And for young Woody, life didn't revolve around parties or popularity. It revolved around storytelling. But unlike many cinephiles, Allen wasn't interested in imitating his idols. He studied their work obsessively, yes, but to understand their rhythm, their emotional architecture, their hidden mechanisms. He absorbed Kurosawa's silence, Bergman's stillness, Fellini's chaos. He wanted to know how they made the intangible, despair, ecstasy, guilt, visible. This foundation would influence all his films to come, from the romantic longings of Manhattan to the dark psychological layers of crimes and misdemeanors. Allen's films were never just scripts and actors. They were personal essays disguised as fiction, each frame a confession, a curiosity, or a quiet prayer for understanding. And as the decades passed, Allen never let go of those early influences. Even at the height of his fame, with Oscars in hand and sold-out screenings around the world, he remained that kid in the back row of the theater, letting the magic of other people's visions wash over him. He never stopped being a fan, and perhaps that's why his favorite movies aren't just technically brilliant, they're deeply human. Films that spoke to him not just as a director, but as a flawed, searching, sentimental man who never stopped believing in the power of cinema to make sense of the chaos. For Woody Allen, cinema was never just entertainment. It was a lens through which he interpreted the universe. His films are often described as neurotic, philosophical, and at times nihilistic, but what they really are is deeply personal. They reflect a worldview shaped not just by life experiences, but by the films that moved him in ways words couldn't. For Allen, great movies weren't just visual spectacles. They were meditations on existence, death, morality, and the fleeting nature of happiness. And so the films he admires most, the ones he would come to name as his all-time favorites, aren't necessarily the most popular or conventional. They are instead the films that ask the big questions, the ones that dared to confront the absurdity of life head-on, without sugarcoating it. Allen has long spoken of his admiration for European filmmakers, especially Ingmar Bergman. To him, Bergman was not just a director, but a philosopher with a camera. Films like The Seventh Seal and Persona introduced Allen to the idea that movies could function like existential essays, confronting mortality, faith, sexual repression, and loneliness, all through imagery and subtext rather than plot. In interviews, Allen has said, "When I saw The Seventh Seal, I realized that cinema could be as profound as any novel or piece of music." This became a turning point in his life, shifting his aspiration from merely writing jokes to expressing something much more enduring and introspective. Another influence that deeply shaped Allen's creative sensibilities was Federico Fellini. Films like 812 and La Strada showed him how chaos could be beautiful, how dreams and memories could coexist with reality on screen. Fellini's willingness to blur the lines between absurdity and pain gave Allen permission to lean into surrealism, particularly in films like Stardust Memories and Deconstructing. Harry, there's a deep kinship between Fellini's introspective circus of broken characters and Allen's own ensemble of morally complicated New Yorkers. Both directors wrestled with guilt, desire, and the burden of being artists in a world that often fails to understand them. But while Bergman and Fellini gave Allen his intellectual and emotional framework, it was the neo-realism of Italian post-war cinema, particularly Bicycle Thieves, that awakened his empathy. Watching a father and son wander the streets of Rome in search of a stolen bicycle, Allen was struck by how a simple story could speak to something so universal. The heartbreak was quiet but overwhelming. And that's the kind of storytelling Allen would chase for the rest of his life, honest, tragic, intimate. He once said that Bicycle Thieves was perfect cinema, nothing manipulative, no unnecessary grandeur. Just raw, human truth. That truth became the gold standard for the kinds of stories he wanted to tell. Even the American films Allen admired tended to have a strong philosophical backbone. Citizen Kane, for instance, taught him that cinema could be epic and intimate at the same time, a sweeping story built on one man's loneliness. The Treasure of the Sierra Madre and A Place in the Sun revealed the darker layers of ambition and self-destruction. He wasn't drawn to happy endings or traditional hero arcs. Instead, he gravitated toward films where characters were undone by their own flaws. He once remarked, "Real life is rarely redemptive. Movies that reflect that feel more honest to me." These philosophical undercurrents would become the core of Allen's own creative work. Every one of his favorite films, he said, taught him that it's okay to not have answers. That cinema doesn't need to solve problems. It only needs to illuminate them. Whether it was through haunting imagery, minimalist dialogue, or tragic irony, the directors he revered taught him that confusion is often the most truthful human condition. And so Allen's films rarely end neatly. Lovers part. Good people suffer. Questions linger. And that's precisely why his admiration for these profound, unsettling films has never wavered. So when Woody Allen names his favorite movies, he's not just sharing a list. He's sharing a mirror of his soul, a catalogue of the films that gave shape to his fears, his longings, and his relentless search for meaning in a world that often makes none. They are the movies that taught him that to be human is to be uncertain, and that art's job is not to comfort us, but to reflect the truth, however painful or absurd that truth may be. As Woody Allen's own directorial voice matured, his admiration for certain films only deepened. And though he's made over 50 feature films, From the breezy charm of Midnight in Paris to the icy precision of Match Point, Allen has never been shy about acknowledging the works he wishes he had made himself. These aren't just films he loves. They're the ones that, in his own words, left him jealous. Not for their popularity, but for their completeness, their honesty, their ability to say something profound with such economy, grace, and emotional clarity that he found himself wondering how they even existed at all. For a director as prolific and opinionated as Allen, that kind of he has, for decades, spoken openly about The Bicycle Thieves, the 1948 Italian neo-realist masterpiece by Vittorio De Sica. To Allen, this film represents pure, unfiltered cinema. No spectacle, no fancy effects, just humanity, captured with brutal simplicity. He once said, "If I had made The Bicycle Thieves, I'd feel like I never had to make another film again." The film's portrayal of desperation, dignity, and fatherhood haunts him to this day, and you can see echoes of its realism and emotional restraint in some of Allen's own quieter works, like Interiors and Blue Jasmine. Another film Allen has called flawless is The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman. This isn't surprising, considering Allen has often referred to Bergman as his cinematic god. The existential dialogues between the night and death, the stark black and white cinematography, the heavy themes of faith and futility, these elements shaped Allen's understanding of what cinema could be. In fact, entire sections of Love and Death and Hannah and Her Sisters are essentially homages to Bergman. Yet even as he playfully mimicked him, Allen knew he could never truly match that level of intellectual gravity. Bergman had the courage to say things I only danced around, he admitted in a late-career interview. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the films that shaped Woody Allen, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Which director do you think had the biggest influence on modern cinema? Your support helps us continue telling the untold stories behind the legends of Hollywood. Perhaps one of the more surprising films Allen reveres is The 400 Blows by François Truffaut. Though stylistically different from Allen's own films, the coming-of-age poignancy of the French New Wave classic struck a chord with him. He admired Truffaut's ability to capture the quiet rebellion of youth without moralizing or melodrama. The final freeze frame, with the boy's expression locked between hope and despair, haunted Allen long after the credits rolled. He has said, "That last shot, it's one of the most perfect images in film history. It says everything." Then there's Rashomon by Akira Kurosawa, a film Allen called devastating. Not for its violence, but for the way it shattered the notion of objective truth. The idea that four people can witness the same event and walk away with four different versions, that fascinated Allen. It's a concept he would revisit again and again in his own films, especially in Crimes and Misdemeanors, where guilt, morality, and memory collide in ways that refuse to offer easy answers. What all of these films have in common, and what makes Allen envy them, is not just technical mastery. It's courage. Courage to be ambiguous. Courage to leave things unsaid. Courage to trust the audience. Allen once confessed that his own films, even the most serious ones, often fell short of this. "I always put in a joke," he said, "even when the scene wants to be heavy. It's like I can't help myself." These favorite films of his, however, did not flinch. They embraced sadness, absurdity, moral chaos, fully, unapologetically. And in that admiration lies a deep truth about Woody Allen. Beneath the wit and the neuroses, beneath the jazz soundtracks and New York skylines, is a man who spent his whole life trying to make films that moved people the way those films moved him. He knew what greatness looked like because he'd seen it. Again and again. In dusty black and white prints, in subtitles, in foreign languages, in flickering frames that stayed with him long after the projector stopped spinning. At 89, Woody Allen, perhaps one of the most polarizing yet prolific auteurs in modern cinema, finally confirmed what fans and cinephiles have speculated for decades. The 6 films that shaped him, haunted him, and ultimately defined the lens through which he saw the world. In interviews, essays, and offhand comments over the years, Allen would hint at the movies he considered untouchable, works of pure emotional and philosophical genius. And now, as the end of his career looms and the noise of controversy fades into the background, he's laid it all bare. His choices are telling, not because they're obscure, but because they reveal a man more interested in truth than spectacle, more enchanted by subtlety than shock, and more haunted by meaninglessness than most of his audience ever realized. The first of the six is no surprise. The Bicycle Thieves, 1948, by Vittorio De Sica. Allen has long called this the perfect film, a simple story of a man and his son, yet loaded with heartbreak, dignity, and despair. For Allen, this movie crystallized what film could be, a mirror held up to the rawest parts of humanity. No trickery, just truth, he once said. It hurts because it's so honest. The emotional economy of the film deeply influenced Allen's own narrative style. Its quiet, observational tone visible in works like Interiors and Blue Jasmine. Second on the list is The Seventh Seal, 1957, by Ingmar Bergman. This film didn't just impress Allen, it possessed him. The image of a knight playing chess with death became, in Allen's mind, the definitive metaphor for existence. Bergman dealt with the questions we all try to avoid, Allen said. He did it with poetry and dread, and it never felt false. Allen would spend much of his career chasing that same existential resonance, from love and death to crimes and misdemeanors. It's no accident that his most serious films often echo Bergman's rhythms, framing, and tone. Third, 812, 1963, by Federico Fellini. This surreal, deeply personal masterpiece about artistic paralysis and self-doubt resonated powerfully with Allen, especially later in life. Fellini gave permission to be messy, Allen once reflected, to explore your own neuroses without apology. Stardust Memories, Allen's semi-autobiographical film, often compared to 812, mirrors Fellini's structure, shifting between dreams, memories, and fantasy, with a similar tone of frustrated genius searching for peace in a world that refuses to make sense. Fourth is The 400 Blows, 1959, by François Truffaut, a film Allen has described as achingly human. Its portrayal of youthful alienation, parental disconnect, and societal indifference moved Allen in ways few films ever had. He was especially taken with its famous final shot, the freeze frame of a young boy's uncertain future. That face, Allen said, it says everything. Hope, fear, defiance. No dialogue needed. While Allen never made a coming-of-age film in the traditional sense, his attention to quiet suffering and inner conflict owes much to Truffaut's influence. Fifth is Rashomon, 1950, by Akira Kurosawa. Its groundbreaking structure, where one story is told through multiple conflicting perspectives, fascinated Allen intellectually and emotionally. He was drawn to its central idea, that truth is subjective, slippery, and often unknowable. That's life, he mused. We all tell ourselves stories to survive, and none of them are quite right. You can see Rashomon's DNA in Allen's films like Cassandra's Dream and Matchpoint, where morality is fogged by perception, and justice is often an illusion. And finally, Allen's sixth favorite, Citizen Kane, 1941, by Orson Welles. Though less philosophical than the others, Kane captivated Allen with its bold ambition. Welles made you feel the power of cinema, he once said. Every shot had muscle. The way Citizen Kane wove together fractured timelines, psychological depth, and haunting visuals convinced Allen that film could do anything, that it was the ultimate storytelling machine. While Allen's own work remained smaller in scale, the technical confidence of Welles gave him the courage to experiment with nonlinear structures and introspective monologues. These six films, The Bicycle Thieves, The Seventh Seal, 812, The 400 Blows, Rashomon, and Citizen Kane, aren't just a list of great cinema. They're a confession, a map, a soul laid bare. They represent a lifetime of longing for meaning, clarity, beauty, and redemption. They explain the sadness that permeates even Allen's comedies, the searching that never stops in his dramas. And as he nears 90, Allen isn't trying to sell a brand or defend a legacy. He's simply looking back at the films that, in his words, made life seem a little less unbearable. Because for Woody Allen, cinema was never just an art form. It was therapy. It was prayer. It was a flashlight in the dark. And these six films, quiet, brilliant, and profoundly human, were the ones that lit his way.